Welcome to the first of a series of 3 election forums. The idea of this series was to draw on the immense expertise of the Maxwell faculty to actually answer your questions about some of the policy issues coming up during the election campaign. I was a little bit worried that the presidential debates would just resolve all of the uncertainty. But I feel safe in saying that there'll probably be a few issues that haven't been clarified yet and are not likely to in the remaining 3 debates. This series is for you, students and alumni. The whole idea is that we would bring distinguished experts from the faculty to maybe lay out broadly what the big issues are, and then answer your questions. So if you haven't come with big questions about the environment and education, think of some. And Pete Wilcoxen and Sarah Pralle are definitely my 2 favorite people in the world to answer those questions. And you know, one of the things that's really, I've only been at Syracuse for 3 years, but one of the things that just really impressed me when I first got here was just the immense breadth of knowledge and expertise of the faculty and the passion that my colleagues have for these subjects. And I know that's part of what has you here. And I'm really grateful to Sarah and to Pete, and Bob Bifulco is going to show up later to talk about education for kicking off this series. I want to thank a few people who've done a lot of work for this, in particular Gilly Cantor, who did almost all the organizational work, which was a tremendous amount of work. She got help from Rosemary Tavares, Kathleen Fenney in the PIA office, Norma Shannon. I love Norma. She came up to me and said, "I'm so excited about this series." Oh, great! Everybody else just sounds tired. Tom Fazio is doing the technical wizardry, and Larry Weinberg helped set up the live feed as well. With that, I'd like to introduce Paul Wasmund, who's the president of STEP, and turning it over to the students.
Thanks, everybody, for showing up. This is going to be the environmental portion of the talk. So just like to introduce our panel here. Peter Wilcoxen is a senior research associate in the Center for Policy Research and the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Administration. His research focuses on energy and climate policy. And Sarah Pralle is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science here at Maxwell. And her research focus is environmental interest groups and environmental politics. So without further ado, we'll open it up.
Thanks, everybody, for showing up on Friday afternoon, which is a big sacrifice. Let's see if I can do this without causing feedback. So this is supposed to be informal, but I'm going to put up some slides. There are all differences in the policies between Obama and Romney. So climate change, President Obama, the Obama administration, supported a 2009 cap and trade bill that cleared the House called the Waxman-Markey bill. It didn't get through the Senate, and so the glass is, the scorecard as far as the Obama administration is concerned is only half, right? They got a 50% on that, right? It's maybe a C, because they really dropped the ball completely on trying to get the bill through the Senate. It was, I think, in retrospect, a big failure of the administration. So the administration supports doing something about climate. When push came to shove, they didn't shove very hard. The second thing that's important is that the Obama administration did, through the EPA, go through a process which is known as an endangerment finding. So the EPA has the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate air pollutants which are deemed to be endangering the public health. And EPA had not identified CO2 as such a pollutant because in general it isn't toxic. But they went through the formal process to to find that it endangers public health. So they now begun a process of regulating CO2 under the Clean Air Act. And so that's a plus in terms of doing something like climate. There will be some movement going forward, or at least going into the courts on climate policy, with CO2 being regulated under the Clean Air Act. The EPA is now starting by regulating large sources, in particular power plants, so they're drafting regulations. And one of their proposed standards, which would only apply to new power plants, is that new power plants would have to have CO2 emissions that are equivalent or better than natural gas, advanced natural gas plants can achieve. And that is essentially impossible for new coal plants to attain. So that's led to the accusation that the Obama administration is carrying out a war on coal, which is patently false, and I'll show you why. So it's true that this standard makes new coal generation difficult. The reason why that is false, that this is a war on coal, is that the war on coal is already over and coal has already lost, okay? Now, the Obama administration has also increased CAFE standards on cars. Car fuel efficiency is scheduled to double by 2025. That will make a significant dent in CO2 emissions. And as you know, if you watch any of the debate, the Obama administration spent a lot of the stimulus money on things that are related projects: solar, wind, batteries, insulation for houses, new windows, nuclear research, and electric vehicles. So they spend money on trying to get a lot of deployment of products that would cut CO2 emissions. Romney's position is basically, his current position is basically against all of those things. As governor of Massachusetts, he favored an agreement called RGGI, which is a regional cap and trade program. Massachusetts was one of the original participants in RGGI, but at the last minute, he withdrew Massachusetts from RGGI while he was governor over a technical issue, which we could talk about if you're interested. He has stated that he's unwilling to spend to undertake any high-cost policies. He's unwilling to spend billions of dollars on climate policy. He does not support EPA regulation of CO2 under the Clean Air Act. He's advocated rolling that back, which Congress could do if it wants. And he does not support increased CAFE standards. Okay, so the Romney position is really not to do anything about climate policy in the near term. Now, the war on coal, so just to fact check this, coal plants are expensive. So the capital cost of building a new coal plant is almost $3 billion to build a 1 gigawatt capacity coal plant. To build the equivalent in natural gas plants is $1 billion, right? So there's a 3-to-1 difference in the capital costs of these plants. Now, without any sort of policy interventions. Now, the reason that people built coal plants for a long time is that coal is essentially burnable dirt, and it's pretty much as cheap as dirt, right? So this graph shows you the price, the cost, fuel cost in cents per kilowatt hour for coal used for power plants. So the cost of the coal going into a coal-fired power plant, its contribution to the cost of electricity is about 1 cent in 2000. It's a little higher than that now, okay? Almost very, very little. The national average price of electricity is 9 cents. In New York State, it's probably 12, 13 cents. So the reason people built coal plants, coal was very cheap, and for a while they weren't allowed to build natural gas plants, and then they hesitated after they were allowed to build natural gas plants because they were worried about this kind of thing. This is the price of natural gas for the per kilowatt hour, and you can see it's very volatile. And utilities build plants that last 40 years. They hate volatility, right? It makes it very risky. So they didn't build a lot of gas plants for a long time, okay? But as you all know, gas prices have fallen, and they're not going to go up again, basically. There's just been huge expanses of territory where gas has been found to be available with advanced drilling techniques, and it's going to keep gas prices low. So, some of you are in or have been through some of my classes. You'd be glad to know that all that stuff that you have to endure gets applied in calculations like this. So what you might say is, well, what's the life cycle cost of these plants? Coal plant, it's more expensive to build, cheaper to run, okay? How does it work out? Well, if you say, coal plant, we're going to take 40-year planning horizon. We take fuel costs in 2011. You look at the size of the coal plant, the average fraction of the time it runs, take the present value calculation over the course of 40 years, and this is what you see. So here's the capital cost of the coal plant, capital cost of the natural gas plant, fuel cost of coal, fuel cost of gas a little higher. The total is clearly cheaper for gas, okay? 5 to about $3.8 billion. So this has not gone unnoticed by the electric utilities, okay? Electric utilities have been building gas capacity. They've been building it so fast. Some of you have heard this before, but electric utility executives have said that natural gas is the crack cocaine of their industry. They've been building these plants like crazy. And like crazy, by like crazy, I mean not just a little crazy, like unprecedented in American history, okay? This is the generating capacity of the United States in 2010, sorted by the fuel and the vintage of the plant. So what this green line shows you is the coal generating stock. So what it shows is up to 1950, the bulk actually of the US generating capacity was hydro up to 1950 of the stuff that's still in operation. Okay, then a lot of coal plants were built, and then you see this flat part? Nobody was building coal plants for years, okay? There's been a little increase in coal capacity out here because a couple of big old plants were taken offline and replaced with newer plants. But basically, coal has been flat. This is natural gas. So in the space of about 10 years, the industry has built more than 250 gigawatts of natural gas generating capacity. That has a price tag of about $250 billion. So the idea that there is some force that is working against coal is true, but it's the market force that natural gas is really cheap, okay? If you look at total US generating capacity and you take this huge spike of natural gas on top, this is the picture that you see, okay? There's these two little hairlines in here. This one is in 1997, and this little hairline is in 1999. And if you decide to build a natural gas plant, and you have already done all the permitting, it takes about 2 years, what happened in 1997 that might be relevant? Anybody know? No, that's a good question, but that's, people have known that gas in Marcellus was there for a long time. There were some recent estimates which said there's more of it than people thought, but the advance that has made it accessible is hydrofracking, and that's become much more popular, but the gas was known. But well, not everyone spends all their waking hours thinking about climate change, but 1997 was when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, okay? So the Kyoto Protocol, as many of you probably know, was signed. It's a big international climate agreement. The US never ratified it, okay? But if you ran a regression, so some of you who are taking quantitative analysis courses, just think out there. If you took this information, you ran a regression, if there's any way you could come up with a regression that didn't find that this date made a difference in the power industry, there's just no way you could set up a regression and not have that come in significant, right? Correlation's not causation. You know, I can't say for sure that the industry was looking ahead, but it does seem like they saw the writing on the wall. Okay, so if there was a war on coal, it was carried out by the private sector and it's over, okay? So, oh, dang. Oh, no, there we go, sorry. Okay, so, but while we're at it, because this is not just politics, we should say, should there be a war on coal? And the answer is yes, okay? So this graph shows the full social costs of getting electricity from a bunch of different sources. Okay, so what I've just shown you is the financial cost of getting electricity from coal and natural gas, and that's the battle that coal has already lost. This shows, if you take into account externalities, what the costs are. So the little gray bars at the bottom are the financial cost of generating electricity from existing coal plants, new gas plants, new coal plants, wind with natural gas backup, nuclear, PV. And so you can see existing coal is dirt cheap down here. And it goes up as you go to the right. This graph came from Michael Greenstone, who's at MIT. Okay, if you take best estimates of the non-carbon externalities associated with these fuels, so coal's tremendously dirty even without CO2. It's dirty to get it out of the ground. It's dirty when you burn it. After you burn it, there's a lot of ash and stuff left over. And if you count those costs, you get this purple bar. And so what this shows is that new natural gas plants are cheaper when you count social costs than existing coal plants. Socially, it would be better just to take all that existing capital that's already been built and just turn it off and build new gas plants. That's what this graph shows, if you take into account all the externalities other than CO2. If you count CO2, it's even more skewed. Yeah?
How are you defining socially? Like, what do you mean by social costs?
I'm speaking jargon, so I apologize. So in environmental economics, social cost is jargon for all of the costs that private users face, plus all the externalities that third parties face. So in this case, the social costs are mostly the health impacts to people who breathe particulates or who are near mines and that kind of thing.
So can you quantify that?
There's this course next semester, 777, where I try to talk about that. It's difficult. These numbers are based on a study done by the National Academy of Sciences, which tried to take the best known data. And most of these purple bars come from health impacts, because those are the ones that you can quantify the most rigorously. Okay, so one that's not in here is if there's a lot of loss of visibility because of smoke in the air. That's the kind of thing that's not in these numbers because it's hard to quantify. But people getting sick is. Yeah.
Is there some sort of social benefit that you can compare the costs to?
Well, the social benefit, yes, but the social benefit there is the value of the electricity. Because if you want to think about it, all of these are all ways of producing 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. So you can think of this as producing something that is equally valuable, okay, but these are just looking at the differences in the costs. Okay. So existing coal, when you include CO2, really bad. When you include conventional, still bad compared to new natural gas. Existing coal is more expensive, including the social costs, than new coal, okay, which is really amazing when you consider it's a $3 billion cost to build a new coal plant. But if you take the cost of a new coal plant plus these other externalities, new coal is terrible. We should not build any new coal plants ever, okay? Now, fortunately, the industry has already done that, more or less. And so the assertion that the Obama administration's EPA ruling that new coal plants are going to have to achieve this standard of emissions of gas plants, which are much cleaner, is not binding, right? It's not, because nobody is going to build a new coal plant during the period where that rule will take effect. So nobody is going to be impacted by it because they're going to be building this. Yeah?
It's whether the externality costs take into account risk of disaster during extraction. I guess there's a lot of controversy with measure fracking.
Yeah, so the coal numbers, I think, do take into account risks on mining, especially risks of like mine failures and things. For natural gas, I think it is the case that none of these not enough is known about the risks and the damages of hydrofracking. I think none of that is in here. Okay. Now, of course, if you put that in, what you'd be talking about is higher purple bars here. But we're going to talk a little bit about hydrofracking in a minute. But keep in mind that hydrofracking's riskiness depends on how it's done. So it's an endogenous choice. This is a place where the campaigns differ in a way that you might find important. Okay, yeah.
Why did the administration feel the need to even make it a regulation for the EPA if the market is already doing it?
I think they're actually required to as part of the rules. Like once they invoke the endangerment ruling that CO2 is hazardous, they have to go through a bunch of steps. So this is part of something known as the new source performance standards. And so they have to say, well, this is hazardous. So our first rule is that new plants have to hit this particular threshold. And they are nervous, frankly, about proceeding with actual binding regulations on existing plants for a lot of reasons that you probably can think about. But the first thing they wanted to do was to make sure that for new plants, nobody was tempted to do anything dumb. But there was all kinds of hysterical stuff in the press about how this is going to cause people's electricity prices to skyrocket, right? So you know, if I come up to you and I say, you're not allowed to buy a dump truck, and you actually had no intention of buying a dump truck, right? Your life and the cost of whatever you're doing is not going to be affected. And so that was complete hyperbole.
Before you go to fracking, I wondered whether Sarah wanted to say anything
Yeah,
about
sorry.
the coal interest group politics.
Yes,
Because
yes.
in my experience working in the administration was that coal is still enormously powerful, especially given the Senate.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree, right? It's even if they're not building new plants, their lobbying power is still pretty strong.
And that's why you heard both of the candidates talk about clean coal. There was a funny ad going around on Facebook, probably elsewhere too, that showed, it said something on, the clean coal came up in the campaign, which is a fiction. Climate change didn't, which is real, you know? So, you know, to some extent that speaks to what's going on, right? That you say this clean coal, which really doesn't exist, or it would be so prohibitively expensive, especially given now the dropping gas prices, that it doesn't make any sense really to do clean coal. I mean, Pete can maybe disagree, but what I've heard, the energy to take to actually clean it would be so ridiculous that it wouldn't make it cost effective or environmentally friendly. And yet it's a nod to the coal industry and to the power of the lobbies.
Sarah, has politics changed now that West Virginia isn't a swing state anymore, and it seems like all the coal-producing states are dead red? So maybe
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the delegations, but are the delegations to Congress? I mean, there's still some Democrats that are pro-coal because of the regional politics. Yeah, you still have some. Yeah, that's right. You probably won't. They'll get voted out eventually, but there still are some Democrats from those areas that vote for pro-coal and against climate change, and so some of it is not partisan but regionally based.
Indeed. So no, that was just in prose, repeating something. So this is maybe fits into this conversation. So you might wonder, well, why are they talking about this? If the coal industry is already on the floor, why is it a big deal? And the answer, I think, is at least in part that there are big regional differences in how much coal is used in the electricity generating mix. And so when you look at this map, if I cover up this thing, right, you look at this map and you see a bunch of red states, and they're where you expect red states to be for the most part, right? Well, what this graph actually shows is the change in people's electricity price if carbon were priced, right? If there were a fee for emitting carbon that were the same across the country, this shows how much people's electricity price would change. And so it basically pinpoints the people who are very dependent on coal. So there's a lot of coal in these states, not so much in Illinois because they have a lot of nuclear. And then you can see on the coast, where there's more support for doing something about climate change. There's not much coal in the fuel mix, and it's not going to be a big deal for them. So here's West Virginia, which is both the source of coal and a user of coal, but there are a lot of users spread out around the country. So, okay, so this is, I'm going to abbreviate this so there's more time for discussion and question, but another thing that I want to sort of fact check is what is happening with energy independence, okay? And the first thing is that the term energy independence is misleading and useless, okay? That this is a giant diagram of the entire US energy sector as of a couple years ago. The important thing is that 34% of our energy in the country comes from outside the country. And this has worried, as you probably know, every president since Richard Nixon, okay? And essentially the president has almost no ability to do very much about this, or at least presidents to date haven't. But if you wanted to be energy independent, what it would mean is being oil independent, not energy. This is all about oil. Because in this diagram, the vast majority of what imported energy we get is oil. That's the red. And there are two parts to this. If you want to be energy independent, you would have to cause all of this oil to start coming from domestic sources. And you would also probably want to reduce the demand for oil, because almost all of it goes into transportation. So if you want to be energy independent, you'd have to somehow replace all of that with this, or a lot of it, and to make that smaller. So energy independence is oil independence. And so in terms of fact checking, so we've sort of fact checked the war on coal thing. The fact check here is, does the Obama administration get any credit for the reduction in oil imports that have happened in the last few years? Because the Obama administration has tried to take credit for that, and the answer is no, right? Except in maybe the ironic twist that by failing to get the economy out of the recession, they have kept demand for oil down. But here's what happened. So this is U.S. crude oil and U.S. supply and import. So there's a big dip in driving and transportation because of the recession out here. So that reduced demand. And then this green line is domestic supply. And there's a blip upward. And the blip upward is almost exclusively due to hydraulic fracturing being used to get oil out of tight formations in Montana and in parts of Texas. So this is basically the oil industry's advanced drilling techniques coming online. And neither of those are really the responsibility of the administration. And so if you have a drop, for people who have been through my managerial econ class, this is really familiar. If demand drops and domestic supply goes up, bam, down goes imports. And that's exactly what's happened, okay? But it's not the administration, okay? It's probably a good thing, but it isn't something they should get credit for. And so, well, we talked about that. Okay, then the two parties, the two candidates differ on several other things. One of them, which I skipped over, is hydraulic fracturing. The quick story there, we'll flip back to it. The quick story there is that both parties are in favor of hydraulic fracturing. The question is who gets to regulate it. So the Obama administration wants it to be regulated federally. The Romney campaign says it should be done at the state level. Okay, and so this goes back to the question about how risky it is. So when you think about whether hydraulic fracturing is risky or not, you have to decide who will do a better job of regulating it. Okay. Another thing that the two campaigns are sort of in agreement about is the Keystone XL pipeline, okay, which is a pipeline from Canada where it would allow greater exploitation of tar sands for oil, a pipeline down to Texas. And there are really two parts. There's an existing pipeline that goes through a lot of the country, but there are two new segments that have been proposed. This one, which would go through Montana and make it easier for people to get some of that new Montana oil to market, and a new section down here, which goes from Oklahoma to Texas. And the Romney campaign is in favor of approving both of those pieces. The Obama administration is in favor of the southern piece. Now, the Obama administration doesn't have direct regulatory authority over the southern piece, right? Because the pipeline goes across a national border, the president has to approve this piece, but the president doesn't have to approve this piece, and it was clearly going to go ahead, so he has embraced it. Okay? And it also doesn't have some of the environmental risks that are associated with this northern part. Okay? Environmentally, people don't like the northern part because the tar sands are very dirty. It's very dirty to get the oil out of the tar sands, and there's a risk that there could be a rupture in the pipeline and damage sensitive ecosystems along the way. And then there are other differences, but let me stop and let you guys ask questions, or Sarah to respond.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just say a few words because I'd rather hear you guys what you have to say. But I wanted to start out by saying that Pete and I did one of these for undergraduates 4 years ago. Do you remember that? In the Maxwell Auditorium. And I had a slide up that had, McCain and Obama, and it was like, they both support cap and trade. We're finally going to get climate change legislation. And I was not being overly optimistic. I'm somewhat cynical when it comes to us actually acting on climate change. But that's the most hopeful I'd ever been, because both candidates were talking about it, both pledged that they were going to do cap and trade. And it looked like, okay, no matter who's president, this is going to be in the next 4 years, we're finally going to get climate change legislation. Well, we all know that didn't happen. And once the economy fell out, that's part of the explanation, I think, was it displaced a lot of these environmental issues. Obama didn't make it a priority because he now had this huge issue that he had to deal with, and he decided to make healthcare a priority. And then we got 2010, we got the Tea Party, and we got even further, the Republican Party went even further to the right. And now I'm just so struck by the differences between that election, that campaign, and this campaign, where now no one's talking, neither of the candidates is talking about climate change, where Romney feels like he will not get punished politically for actually making a joke about climate change at the national convention, the Republican National Convention. You might remember him saying, Obama wants to help, prevent the seas from rising. Ha ha ha, I'll help your families. And where not just the Republicans, but there's a movement on the right, funded in part by the Koch brothers and some other oil and gas interests, to actually taint the image of green energy, renewable energies like wind and solar. And you're starting to see this, right? And so now you're starting to see Romney even, bad talk renewable energy, which is something that has been a very bipartisan issue in the past. Okay, so if you do public opinion surveys, you find that given a choice between fossil fuels and renewables, vast majority of Americans choose renewables, right? In Congress, in legislatures, even though our policies have favored oil and gas and fossil fuels over renewables, it hasn't been such a zero-sum game between them, right? So we can support renewables through these, subsidy programs, and we support the oil and gas, right? So it hasn't felt a zero-sum. And then this election, it seems like there's an attack on renewable energies that I have never seen before, at least that not in my memory have I seen that kind of outright attack. And a part of this is being funded, or not funded, but the right wing, Koch brothers, et cetera, are funding these campaigns deliberately to try to take this sort of mom and apple pie view of renewable energies and change that. And that is also something that I think is new and different, which I haven't seen before. I think oil and gas, they've opposed climate change, obviously. They don't want the prices of fossil fuels to go up. But they also haven't had this kind of outright attack on renewables, in part because they haven't been a big threat. And I'm not sure what's at the heart of this, like why they they see a political opening, I suppose, to sort of attack technologies that have generally enjoyed a lot of widespread support. And you're starting to see this show up in the polls now, where while Americans still support renewable energies, they're much less supportive of government funding to go to renewable energies. So you see the biggest disparity between Republicans and Democrats now on funding, giving government money to go towards renewable energy. And we see this now, again, Romney being able to come out against the production tax credit for wind, which again has been pretty bipartisan in the past. I mean, it comes up for reauthorization a lot, and to take a very fossil fuel oriented stand. And his whole energy policy is kind of like the energy policy of 1970. You know, before, I mean, it's really like a throwback that you, that I just haven't, you know, it's so heavily on fossil fuels and against any kind of sort of movement to alternatives that it's almost like the last 40 years haven't happened. So that would be sort of, that's my sort of take on it, and I'm more curious as to what your questions are, and you know, if we can just have a conversation. So.
I guess my question is, it seems very obvious to me that some of these things should be bipartisan, that they're market solutions, that they're that there are ways that they could be messaged that might garner more support, but that there's such an issue with messaging that it's not garnering that sort of support. So what's something that, say, President Obama could do to support in a greater way a change in the messaging that would get support for something like a cap and trade bill to get through?
I mean, that's a great question. If I could answer that, I'd be getting a lot of consultant fees, I think, from environmental groups. You know, I think let me start with saying what I think he's done. I mean, he's moved away from just talking about it directly, right? So clearly they haven't come up with an alternative messaging. And I think what he's moved towards instead is doing these kind of policy changes that haven't gotten as much attention, like the doubling of the CAFE standards by 2025. That's going to have a huge impact. I mean, if that actually happens, and you know the auto companies don't lobby and get those pushed back, that'll have a huge impact on our oil consumption and on our climate change. So that's one thing, is that he's doing, and then the EPA regulations, that hasn't gone as far on CO2. They haven't really moved as far forward with that. He has pledged he wants to get 80% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2035. How he does that, I'm not sure how he's going to do that with a renewable, you know, I'm not sure how he would do that. But if that were, you know, possible, so I see him moving more like not even just talking about the big climate change, but sort of doing these initiatives that are bringing down our emissions, or that there's a hope to bring them down in the future, as well as boost a lot of research and technology and renewables. And I guess that's just been a practical kind of retreat from putting climate change front and center. And I'm not even sure, you know, I don't know if it's only a messaging problem, and I'd be curious what you think, you know, what you mean by that. It's a salience problem too. I mean, you know, the voters, this is not the first top issue on voters' concerns, right? And if it's not going to be, you know, if it's not going to be a winnable issue in an election, but it could hurt him in an election, then why bring it up? You know, why spend his political capital on it if he's not going to get rewarded for it? And unfortunately, that is what is going on. It has to become a more salient issue. I mean, it was very interesting. Dan Maffei came and talked to my undergraduate class, and I'll just share a little story that he told me. Because he was in Congress, right, when the House passed the 2009 cap and trade bill. And he later got ousted, as you know, by Anne Marie Burkle, right? So he was explaining his reasoning, right, in having to vote. He had to vote for this cap and trade bill that was being pushed by the Democratic leadership. And he said, you know, I'm going to vote for it, and he did, because that, you know, he's a Democrat, and that was kind of what his voters had, you know, his constituents he thought would want, right, or at least the people that voted for him. But he knew it had no chance of passing the Senate, okay? So he thought, okay, I'm going to vote for it, but it's not going to pass. And he said he would have preferred it had never come up on the agenda, that Nancy Pelosi had never forced him to vote for it because he thinks it cost him votes. He only lost by 500 votes. He's not saying that that was the only thing that cost him the election, right? That vote. His health care vote was too, right? But he said, at least with health care, we got something from it, right? I mean, there was a chance that the health care would actually pass. He said, I didn't see it, it having a chance of passing, so frankly, I wish it had just never been brought up. So if you can imagine other legislators feeling the same way, that we're in close races, right, that support climate change, but are fearful of the electoral consequences, and you can see why it doesn't come up on the agenda that much, So it's really, the public has to, I think it's gonna have to be from the ground up,
One of the problems, so cap and trade and emissions taxes were originally favored by moderate Republicans, right? I mean, there's been this seesawing because they're much more efficient and cheaper than getting the same regulation, getting the same outcome by direct regulation, which is the route we're going down now. But I don't particularly know whether the current situation is that they're just being used as a political litmus test, climate change and other things, or it's the second thing. There is a salience problem with these policies. If we put into place a cap and trade bill or an emissions tax, everyone will see a price tag immediately on the cost of their energy due to that. If we put into place a CAFE standard, right, the cost implications of that are much murkier. They're much less salient to the public. We say the Clean Air Act is going to be used to regulate CO2, and the EPA gradually goes in. The cost of that will be less salient too. This is a dismaying time to be an environmental economist because all of these ways of solving problems are much more costly than using a cap and trade bill or an emissions tax. But it might be the only way that things actually happen.
So talking about an issue that is higher is all about job creation. And so some of the argument is that if we can invest more in renewables, then we'll have more jobs, but then it would most likely displace jobs, which I don't think that anyone's saying from those other industries that are, as your chart shows, are failing. So do you have any idea what actual surplus of jobs, or fact-checking wise, what those numbers look like? Because I feel like those are some of the big numbers, and that's the only place I've seen the most like this being an issue that is actually talked about, where President Obama has said a few times that that's how I feel like that's how he's sneaking in his environmentals, by talking about the jobs that he can get by investing in it. But are those just going to displace people from the other types of energy?
Almost all the arguments on both sides are mostly bogus about jobs. that these regulations and policies are not giant job killers. And the Romney platform of supporting oil and gas is not a giant job creator either. I mean, what you said, Krista, is mostly accounts for what's going on. Mostly you're moving engineers from one activity to another. You're not taking unemployed people who lost their jobs in Detroit and suddenly turning them into roughnecks drilling in Montana. When you do an honest calculation on either side of the ledger, it's not a huge job benefit or cost.
And as a political strategy, framing it in terms of jobs, you can see both the benefits and the backlash to that, right? So there's reasons why you would do that in a downturn in the economy, but then Solyndra goes belly up, and then he can use that against Obama. So I might just be a purist, but I'm sort of feel at this point, having seen a lot of these different ways to frame these issues, whether it's energy independence, you see how that's backlash too, right? How, now it means hydrofracking and drilling, So I don't know, I'm sort of feeling like now we should just go with the straight on environmental climate change and not try to keep hitching it to these other things, and try to find a way to make those messages resonate more. But I'm not out in the trenches doing it, so.
But also we have to keep debunking the claim that all these things are huge employment killers, because that is not true.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So.
Hey, thanks for coming today. How do you expect the change in the United States to natural gas as an energy source to affect the global market of coal? And do you expect the United States to begin exporting coal more than it has traditionally?
It's
recent
likely. The U.S. already exports a little coal, and the big question is going to have to do with China. So China currently imports a lot of coal, as most people, well, if you follow climate change, you know that China burns a lot of coal, and they're building coal plants very rapidly to expand their electricity supply. And if they keep doing that, it could be a big export market potentially for U.S. coal producers, which, as you probably are alluding to, means that there's no climate benefit from restraining coal production in the United States. It just gets burned somewhere else. The one thing that will slow that down is coal is kind of expensive to transport, and to get it out of Wyoming and onto a ship and then over to China is kind of expensive. And China is wrestling with, you know, that purple bar of externalities on coal. If you're in China, you see that in the air, right? China's got a very, very serious conventional air pollution problem as it stands. So it's an open question and I think it depends a lot on what China does. Let me just add, it also depends on whether the U.S. ends up exporting natural gas, because this is an almost mind-boggling thing, at least for a person my age, but the U.S. could become a net energy exporter. If a lot of hydrofracking goes forward, we could end up with a natural gas glut and putting it on tankers and selling it to places like China. That could be very good for climate, but it remains to be seen whether that will actually happen.
So it seems like we also have a fairly contentious local election going on right now, and I'm just curious to hear your opinions on what effect that will have on climate and environmental policy.
Well, the air around here is getting hot. Does that count?
The House is going to stay Republican, chances
Yeah.
are, whether Dan wins or loses. So my guess is, in terms of national policy, it's not going to matter that much.
Probably not. Probably the big issue will be what happens with hydraulic fracturing in New York State, which you know, the governor has leaned toward, and there was a big study, and they got the DEC got 80,000 comments, and now they're going to do a new health study. So I think that'll be where all the big environmental battles are fought locally. What to do about that?
I have a question related, since I have the microphone now. I guess similar to that question, in terms of local races and like what we can do as voters, do local municipalities or like cities, citywide governments have the power to affect like local sustainability or green or environmental measures? And is there funding like from the state or from federal level, like grants that help local municipalities do that? And are those increasing or decreasing with the federal policies?
So the last question is probably easiest, is that all budgets are getting tighter, and so there's going to be less and less opportunity for local communities to be able to tap into higher jurisdictions' funds. Local communities have a lot of complicated problems to deal with at once. So one of the policies that exists that is already on the books is an initiative called PACE bonds. PACE bonds are a way that a local community can finance energy efficiency improvements for local people who own houses in the area. So one of the things that causes energy consumption to be high is that people need insulation or better windows or new furnace, but they don't want to pay for it or they can't afford to pay for it right up front. So these PACE bonds allow the community to borrow money, install the equipment for the property owner, and then recover the cost through a property tax assessment. In principle, that's a really good idea. It's a really good idea if your jurisdiction happens to be one where people are not defaulting on their properties. And so this is an idea which, at least as of about 2 years ago, was a complete non-starter in Syracuse, because the last thing that the city government wanted to do was to start issuing bonds to pay for things that were going to be not repaid by these local property owners. The other thing that cities can do is building codes. You know, that can make a big difference, and land use policies. But it takes a long time, right?
The other thing about the money is, well, it's true that everything's getting tighter. I mean, one strategy that executives use, presidents use to, you know, change policy towards their preferences is through agency budgets. So it's a way you can go get around Congress and just defund the implementation of programs that you don't like. So Republicans voted to defund the program to make light bulbs more efficient, for example. So if you don't give any money for the program, in that case it's done by private entities, so it probably won't have much impact, but you can't have any enforcement of these regulations. So Reagan was famous for doing that, and I don't know what Romney would do, but that's always a strategy, and the EPA's budget tends to not do so great, you know, under Republican presidencies. So the money would get probably even tighter, is my guess.
Congress can do that too. Congress forbid the EPA from working on climate at all for a period of time during the early 90s. Yeah. They just prohibited it.
One more question.
Just before we switch over to education, I wanted to ask you guys about nuclear and both candidates' opinion on nuclear energy as a sustainable and long-term source for running the economy. Both candidates, their perspectives and desires to expand current nuclear energy use in the United States.
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Well, so the Obama administration, for example, has been moving forward on this. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has licensed a couple new reactor designs, and there's construction underway on a new reactor in Georgia. So the Obama administration has supported it, at least sort of reluctantly, right? That it was not originally very popular with the environmental movement until, you know, people faced the fact that nuclear may be less bad than climate. I don't actually know the Romney campaign's position on that.
I'm pretty sure they support nuclear power too, but I think it's going to come back to the cost issue, though, yeah. Right? I mean, with the low price of natural gas, it doesn't make a lot of sense to build nuclear, which has such high capital costs. And so, my guess is if there's a slowdown in there were lots of applications for new nuclear or expansion of nuclear, but my guess is that that's dampened a little with low natural gas prices. Yeah. So.
And Fukushima definitely had a chilling effect.
Yeah, but with no climate policy, there's really not as much of incentive for utilities to invest in those, you know, to invest in it, because they don't, you know, these are long-term commitments, and they don't see the point at this, I think.
You do see some strategic maneuvering, though, because like in my graph about energy prices, Illinois, you know, I mentioned has a lot of nuclear, and the utility that is dominant in Illinois has a lot of nuclear reactors. They have a lot of expertise, and their CEO was out in front on advocating climate change policy, because for them it's a win, right? It's a win, it's a double win, right? They get to feel good about helping to save the environment, and it's something they know how to do and are good at, and it will be good for their business. So as you think about policy, remember that the business world is not monolithic, right? You may be able to enlist people who are important in your side. It just won't be the coal mining people.
Was that time? Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.